I'd like to discuss briefly in these introductory remarks two issues affecting our country. One dealing with democracy and the National Assembly, and the second dealing with the Amaila Falls Hydroelectric project. First, we were told the National Assembly was on. Then, incredibly, Prime Minister Sam Hinds wrote the Speaker of the National Assembly and the clerk to say that it's not on. Later on, we heard, yes, it was on. More significantly than what was this attempt by the Prime Minister to make the executive dominant over the National Assembly was the fact that local government elections and the relevant bills had been up for discussion. The government withdrew those bills. Let us recall, and young voters, young Guyanese, will probably not have experienced local government elections. We have not had them since 1994, despite the fact that our Constitution requires that these be held no less frequently than every 3 years. The Constitution also says that the essence of our country, our democracy, is the right of people to make decisions on who will represent them. And of course, local government elections form an important part of that democratic process. I think it's about time that we bring a halt to this charade in which all the parliamentarians, unfortunately, take part of postponing year after year local government elections. I think it's time that we demand that local government elections be held. And I think it's still possible, if there's the will, if there's the political action to bring it about, that this should happen in 2013. The second issue was Amaila Falls. As you know, some of you may know, there was a press conference held by Raymond Gaskin and me on Wednesday. This was followed by a forum called by the government. The government was represented at the highest levels. Unfortunately, several questions that were being asked at the forum were not answered. I'm pleased to say that the government, President Ramatar, Prime Minister Sam Hinds, have all given an undertaking that the questions will be answered. Now, this is the largest project to come in to Guyana, the largest project to be undertaken by the government of Guyana. It is perhaps about 4 times that of Ng-A-Qui Skeldon modernization project. We clearly need to make important assessments of the decisions involved in introducing hydro. We don't have to even debate whether or not we need hydro. We need renewable power. What we don't need this Scythe, China Development Bank, China Construction Company building a project that costs twice as much as any project that ought to cost of that magnitude. Part of the problem is this substantial financial cost is part that the government is contributing in cash and in guarantees. 80% of the financing of the company. It gets 40% of the votes in the company. Meanwhile, Scythe, which is contributing 18%, gets 60%. And for all the work they do, when they go to China, when they come to Guyana and they do their press conferences and so on, all of that may be charged to the project. So what Scythe is saying they're putting in is not all in cash. We Guyanese need to be on our guard. This project has got to be reviewed. It has got to be revised. If we have to scrap the particular model, and I emphasize model, then we need to do so. Let me quickly say as well that we must not forget, as we speak of the Amaila project, we must not forget the massive extravagance and waste that is called the Chedi Jagan International Airport Extension Project. That is another deal that is, quite frankly, and I can find no other word for it, a rip-off on the taxpayers of this country. I'm appealing to all Guyanese, including our parliamentarians. Let us stop this waste. We as a country cannot afford it, whilst our hospitals and our schools and our university seem to have all kinds of difficulties. My name is Christopher Ram. Welcome to Plain Talk. On Plain Talk today, I'd like to welcome Dr. Norman Ng-A-Qui and Dr. David Hinds, and we will be talking about a forum which is being organized by the Ghana Day Committee on August 4th in conjunction with the COFI 250th Committee of Washington, D.C. It's called Time for Renewal and Empowerment, the State of Black African Guyana. Gentlemen, welcome to Plain Talk.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Chris. Good to be here.
What are we trying to achieve out of this forum? It's a full day forum. You will have academics, social activists, etc. speaking. The public, African Guyanese are invited to participate in this program. What do you hope to achieve?
Well, if I may start, Chris, I don't know what we hope to achieve in the short run. What we hope to achieve in the long run is to begin to tackle some of the deep-seated problems that have developed over time in the African Guyanese community. What we are starting is a conversation. The last time we had a forum of this nature was in 1997. It was organized by ACT, I think, at the National Cultural Center. So you're talking about, 16 years since African Guyanese have gotten together to speak about the problems that the community experiences and what to do about those problems. And in those 16 years, a lot has happened in Guyana, and of course, because we are part of Guyana, we are impacted by all of what has happened in the country. And so what we hope to do is to begin a conversation. And the conversation is extremely important because often we take it for granted that we know what's happening. We have a sense, we have a macro sense of what is happening. What we don't know is how people in their various communities, in their various endeavors, as they go about their day-to-day lives, how is it this problem, and we accept that there's a problem in the African Guyanese community, how is it being experienced? So we want to hear from people firsthand about how they're experiencing these problems. And we start, of course, in Georgetown, and then we go out into the countryside. We have 6 more of these activities. At the end of it, we will, in a sense, have a sense of the state of African Guyanese, economically, politically, socially, culturally. And then having done that, we will then initiate a second round of conversation on how to go about tackling these problems. So at the end of the day, what we're looking at is constructing, if you will, a readiness in the African Guyanese community to take part in Guyana in a full and equal way, to take part in the economy, to take part in the politics of the country, and to become equal citizens in this country.
Dr. Ng-A-Qui, the release announcing the forum said the condition was seen as being in crisis. What does crisis in this context, in fact, means?
Okay, crisis, well, let me back up a little bit. Crisis in this context involves, in essence, the four components of the conference that we're talking about here. There's a cultural crisis. There's an economic crisis. There's a political crisis, right? And there is also a social crisis. The social crisis is exemplified, for example, in things like police brutality. The economic crisis is exemplified by the marginalization of black African Guyanese in the economics of the country. Right? Political crisis is pretty obvious. We have a minority government, so that speaks for itself. That doesn't need a lot of elaboration. And the cultural crisis is part of the major issue that we have, and that is the identification. People are not comfortable, in a lot of cases, identifying themselves as African or black African, because for whatever reason, there tends to be a feeling of disadvantage. There is a disproportional. They feel like minorities in their own skin. Right? So culturally, there is a big issue with the way blacks see themselves, but it also has more to do with consciousness. And I think that from the cultural perspective, that is one of the big things, is making people more aware.
Is any one of those four more important than any other?
No, I think that has tended to be the prior format of discussions, where we have a conference on economics, we have a conference on politics, we have a conference on the social issues. But I think it's important to recognize that they are all linked together. None is more important than the other, because when I go into a situation, I don't go in as an economic entity alone. You go in as a black person going for a loan. And so your culture, your race, your economic situation, the way you feel about yourself, these are all tied together. So you cannot really separate out one component from the other. And I think this is part of what this conference, how it's structured. There won't be any workshops where you break out into little groups to do different things.
Would you be able to achieve that in one day?
No, of course, no. As indicated by David, it's not.
No. I mean, to get all these issues in a single plenary.
No. As indicated, there are 4 sessions. All of them are plenary sessions. All of them are full sessions. There is no small groups being broken out. The intent is that everybody must have a common sense when they leave of all of the issues as discussed by all of the participants. So everybody shares and has a common foundation. Now remember, this is not the end. This is the beginning, as David indicated, of a process. Okay. So, for example, in terms of history, there is so much that is missing in the history of black Africans in Guyana, not only local history, but international history, that people have lost track of. It's not part of any curriculum anywhere. So we hope to start a little bit of that circulating of information about history, so that everybody leaving the forum then feels a different sense of their history. Leaving, it doesn't mean that there's a comprehensive discussion of history. All right.
The year, of course, is significant in terms of the Berbice slave rebellion. And in fact, the release had said the committee felt that there is no better symbol around which to have this discourse on the 4 issues than the Berbice slave rebellion. How do you link the two?
Well, of course, the 1763 rebellion is one of the great rebellions in the African diaspora.
One may say, and Dr. Nigel Westman started in the world.
In the world, yes, sure. I mean, 1763 preceded 1804, the Asian Revolution, which stands out in our history. 1763 preceded 1776, the American Revolution, and the French Revolution that came up. So it's really, in terms of the annals of world history, the 1763 is significant. And it raises the question that how could something so big happen in a place that is so small? Well, what was happening in this place that was so small was that this place was linked to the rest of the world through this enormous project of enslavement. And if you want to understand the enormity of the slave project, you just have to look at Africa, look at Europe, look at the United States. And I make bold to say here that the United States and Europe would not be, quote unquote, as developed as they are had it not been for the slave project that they were involved with. Right?
My question, though, was the link.
I'm coming to that. So what 1763 represents is that African people, black people in Guyana, were not just subjugated, but they did something about it. They fought back, they rebelled, and eventually they overcame. That is the significance, the large significance of 1763. It's a reminder to our people that, look, we did not take the blows lying down. What we did was that we fought back, and in some instances we made our mark, we pushed the system. 1763 would lead to 1823, and 1823 would eventually lead to 1838, the legal abolition of slavery. And if we make that link between then and now, what we live in now, what African people experience on a day-to-day basis are the legacy of slavery. People often ask, why do you harp on slavery all the time? Well, slavery may have ended 175 years ago legally, but the social and political and cultural and economic legacies of slavery still haunt the black community here and in the rest of the world, because you are talking about a system that lasted for 300 and odd years, and you don't overnight dismantle that system. That system would fight as it did to reproduce itself. And as it reproduces itself, it reproduces the inequalities spawned by the system of slavery today. So it is the link between then and now is that the legacies of slavery are still present. And if our people stood up to slavery in 1763 and were successful in pushing that system, we can stand up to the inequalities that exist in the society today. The second significance of that is that the African people, in their condition of enslavement, did it themselves. They did not ask for help from some government. They will not ask for help from some foreign powers. They did it themselves. They created their own rebellion. They created their own revolution. And the lesson there is that if African people recognize that our backs are against the wall, that our condition is terrible, that we have to call on ourselves, dig deep in ourselves to begin to address these problems.
You wish to add anything to that? The link? No. The situation of African Guyanese, there were a number of advances that have been made. I mean, there's no disputing that. Why this setback? Why this setback? And of course, I should let viewers know we're looking forward as well, but we want to put this in perspective. Why the setbacks? I mean, after all, you had Forbes Burnham, Desmond Hoyt, who made tremendous efforts, particularly Forbes Burnham making the real man, and not just the black African, but the entire Guyanese people. You had the various, the banking system, cooperatives. Why did we fall back?
Go ahead, Dave.
Yes, I think, Chris, there are a couple of issues, and I'm very glad you raised that. And in the statement, we did say the advances of the post-emancipation era and the immediate post-independence era, and we were getting to that. I think there are a couple of things. That as a people, African people have to be constantly struggling. And the reason that we have to be constantly struggling and constantly working, it's because what slavery did was that it took away, systematically, legally, and otherwise, it took away from the African people what normal people should enjoy. Took away their humanity, took away their culture, took away their family, took away their dignity, and so forth. Now, if somebody takes that away, it means that you are constantly having right to regain ground, to catch up, and you're constantly playing that. And I guess sometimes our people get weary, sometimes our people get complacent. And I think in the immediate post-independence era, we may have made the mistake of the Kwame Nkrumah's dictum, seek ye first the political kingdom and all other things shall be added unto you. And I make bold to say here today that I think that has turned out to be a mistake. That in the Burnham government, the PNC government, what you had was a quote-unquote black government that attempted to do things. But there are limitations to what an ethnically grounded government could do in a multi-ethnic society. And so therefore I think the great mistake that we made during that period was that we abandoned the notion of self-reliance. We abandoned the notion of solidarity within the group. That is, that the group ought to be constantly preparing itself for when your black government goes out of power. Because political power comes and it goes. Some people today don't understand that, right? But the group has to survive. And so what we saw was that once the PNC exited the stage, that African Guyanese were left vulnerable. And so therefore the lesson from that is that the group has to be constantly looking at its own condition, day in, day out, mobilizing itself, constructing institutions, keeping that conversation go. You take something like education. It was the one area that African Guyanese really excelled. When they bought their villages, two of the first things they did, they created churches and schools. And so education was one of the important planks of African Guyanese advancement. You take somebody like myself, poor, come from Buxton, running around Short Tail. Today, through education, I can be sitting here having this conversation because of education. It didn't come from money.
So can I.
Right. But the point is that we have lost that. We have constantly lost the importance of education to the African Guyanese community because we have taken our eyes off the ball. And so part of what we're trying to do here is to say, let us put our eyes back on the ball and let us keep it there.
Dr. Ng-A-Qui, I know how difficult it is when David is on the program
let me add
to get equal share.
No, I just want to add, no, what he's saying is perfectly correct. But we must understand too that this is not a question of just lost, right? There was an institutional process in place to destroy. And I'm not only talking about a Guyanese society, but globally.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you to explain that.
All right. There is an institutional process to destroy the culture of African heritage. History books, for example. How many history books? I studied history. How many history books ever talk about the African contributions towards civilization in a positive way? Right. I have not seen it, and all growing up, I always thought of history as just a passive. Yeah, no, it was not an active subject. It was something that you know exists, and you don't really know the details because it's not exciting. Now, had I known the true facts about African history and contributions to history, the fact that the Egyptians, black people, educated the Greeks from nothing, that the Moors, black North Africans, literally brought civilization to the Europeans. I mean, all of Europe. Right? My feeling about history and my interest in history would have been totally different. And I would have had a different appreciation for history and therefore a different desire to delve into it. Not until 20 or 30 years later did I realize the significance of history. Now, when I look back at youth in schools, they have no concept of African history and the contributions of Africans to history, and how significant and how tremendous a role black people have played globally. And what has happened is that the history books have deliberately written it out of history, all of the contributions of black people to written it out. So but then that's an example of institutional continuation of repression.
But,
right?
but
Now, well, let me
Sure.
finish. Unless a person has a consciousness, right, you cannot build without a history. A person must have his history in order for them to have a feeling of self, and then they can then build from there. Right? If you are constantly told, you come from Ng-A-Qui, and this is recent. They still say that in some parts of the world. Right? People, black people come from Ng-A-Qui. You can't go anything, you can't do anything. You have not contributed anything to history, therefore shut up, basically. And all of that is a lie. So it is not trivial. The foundation in history and gives a foundation in self. That raises the consciousness. And black people have been left out of the history books, period.
well, but now, and and this is not said to start any kind of controversy, but it is sometimes said that we always seek to blame others. Why is that story with the educated blacks, that blacks have been, I should have added just now, David, that I was educated by black teachers almost my entire primary and high school life. Why is it the African historians, and we ourselves have produced one of the world's outstanding African historians, why have they not told that story?
I think part of it, they have told the story. But telling the story, how many good books are written but not read? Part of it has to do with the system. If the system does not exist to take the work forward, the work will not go forward. Let me give you an example. There's a book called Stolen Legacy, a book written by a Guyanese in the United States that talked about the contribution of the Egyptians to the education of Greece, the Greeks. Okay, that book, right, was literally banned from the United States. Banned. This is not just told, don't read it. It was banned. It was one of the few books in the history that was banned from the United States. Which means you go into a library and you couldn't get a copy of Stolen Legacy. Now that is part of the institutionalization of this hiding. So you have a lot of work that has been done, but could not be presented. For example, let me give you a local example. Look at the content of African history in our curriculum. Do you see any work by Ivan van Sertima? He is one of our stalwarts that has produced world-renowned, and actually history-making research has been done by Ivan van Sertima. Do you see him presented as a substantive author contributor to the history of the world and also to Guyana? We don't see that.
David, well, you're in academia, yes.
Yes. Let me give you a story. Walter Rodney, to whom you refer just now, writing How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, classic texts and history. And Walter told the story that he had just entered the University of the West Indies, and they were asked to write two essays, one on European history and one on African history. And he wrote both. And at the end, he realized he knew so much more about European history and so little about African history. And at that point, he decided, I will study African history. I tell that story to say that part of the problem, and Dr. Ng-A-Qui is quite right about external forces really constantly trying to suppress knowledge about the African experience. But I think internally that we have not done enough to inculcate in our young people, both in the formal system and in the informal system, right? Because I learned more as a youngster growing up in Buxton. I learned more about African Guyanese in the village,
Yes.
right? Not in the formal school system. And so I think part of what has happened is that as the villages have been destroyed, have been decimated, have been vacated, as the villages have gone through that experience, the knowledge of Africa and the African experience has gone with it. And so therefore, part of the problem is the dislocation of the African Guyanese community itself. That means that we are not reproducing in those villages a sense of culture, a sense of history, a sense of achievement. Because one of the things is that you lived in Buxton and you knew as a youngster that we achieved. It was there. Ng-A-Qui was there living on a day-to-day basis. The school teachers were there. And so you wanted to be like them. You wanted to reproduce the community. And unfortunately, that's one of the problems, that the villages and other African communities have been severely dislocated for objective reasons, I may say. And so as a result, we've not been able to reproduce it.
Another statement that was made, and I in the article reporting this forum, work needs to be done with regard to leadership. Now, I find the relationship between the forum and the Berbice Slave Rebellion very interesting, because, of course, it took tremendous leadership skills to rise up under those conditions. Coffee, Ackerby, Atta, and there must have been others as well. How do we define this leadership issue? And what, again, how are you going to address it at the forum?
Well, I think leadership, I'll say a little bit and then I'll ask David. But leadership to me, there was a time when the leader was in front of the army. He was with his sword. Follow me, and the leader was taking the battle. Right? The concept of leader has changed over the years. And we look at the international groups now. The leader, you hardly see the leader, but everybody else is dying in the different forces, right? You look at more recent times where people identify themselves as leader and they're assassinated right off the bat. I'm talking now about Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, all right? And what we find is that the concept of leader, I think, is something that needs to be defined, in my view, again, not as individuals, but you must have leaders in schools, you must have leaders in villages, you must have leaders in your homes, you must have leaders in your work groups. It must be a dispersed leadership where people are leading in a particular field. This is my leader in mathematics, so I could go to that particular group and I could get, and there'll be several leaders in mathematics in the different villages. There'll be several leaders in knowledge sharing, in history. So there's no single person that is burdened with the leadership of everything. So it's more of a functional leadership that is distributed throughout all of the communities. All the communities have leaders in all things. And that's how things, I think, need to grow, not where is your leader, that approach. I don't think in today's day and age that one person cannot address everything. You must have support, and all of the support are all leaders and must be qualified as leaders too. Competent, qualified to support.
But the leadership efficiency would transcend all four of these areas:
Yes.
social, political,
Plus.
economic,
Plus more.
and cultural.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How? Again, we get back. You said it's the the institutional arrangement that has moved towards destroying it. Of course, Boxon, and you mentioned Boxon, David. It's not that you had many Boxons around Guyana. It stands out again in our political history. How do we then reverse that tide and that trend?
I think we've got to go back to the whole notion of self-activity, which I think is what Dr. Ng-A-Qui was getting at. That is to mobilize our people to understand that political leaders are not the only leaders, that you yourself can throw up through your own activity, your own leadership. The most recent classic example of that here in Guyana was the Linden uprising last year, which I put alongside the 1763 uprising, because Linden was significant. I think in time to come, and historians are going to write the history of this country, that Linden uprising will stand out. We do not put it into our consciousness how significant that was, because we kind of get it tied up in the party politics and all of that. But that was a classic example of people throwing up their own struggle, engaging in their own struggle, and throwing up their own leadership. Everybody has been wagging their tongue about Sharma Solomon. Well, Sharma Solomon came out of the struggles of Linden, and that was a classic example, all right? Now, the political leadership that we have had in Guyana in the post-independence era, I would say, have failed the African Guyanese people. And let me explain.
And you're saying that of Burnham and Hoyt
right,
and Corbyn and Ranger?
And all of them. And here is what I'm saying. It is not that those leaders have not attempted, and in some cases were relatively successful in making some advancement or causing some advancements to be made in the African Guyanese community. But as I'm saying, the institution of politics, especially if you're operating in a multi-ethnic society, there are limitations to what that leadership could do. One of the frustrated things about our African political leadership in Guyana is that they have never been able to balance between their national responsibility to the country and their ethnic responsibility to the community that votes for them, right? So you have always heard the political parties say, we are not a racial party, we don't deal with race, we are a multi-ethnic party. Well, they are. I mean, all parties aspire to be multi-ethnic. But if your support comes from a particular ethnic group, then you have got to find a way to balance the two. And I don't think, I've heard some of our political leaders say, the problem is not race. I've never heard a more dumb statement than that in a place like Guyana. The problem is a problem of race. It started from the time Africans came off the shore of Africa right through. And so therefore, our political leadership has failed. The other thing is that whenever indigenous leadership has been thrown up from the communities, again I go back to Linden, that leadership has either been co-opted by the political parties or destroyed by the political parties. I'm saying here that if the African Guyanese
Which is
community...
probably true on the other side as well.
Yes, but
the political structure stifles individual
individuality. That's the point I'm making. And we in the African Guyanese community, and saying African because that's what we're talking about here, we cannot afford for that to happen. It means, therefore, that we have to develop a consciousness in our community, that there are needs in our community, or communities that have to be met, that are not necessarily going to be met by our political leaders. And insofar as our political leaders are there to facilitate some things, fair enough. But we have to develop our own indigenous and community leadership, which is going to move this process forward. It's a hard decision we're making. It is not that we don't have uses to the PNC.
The decision might be the easy part. Getting it done is good.
Well, yeah, but we've got to struggle. We've got to struggle. We've got to struggle to... Linden, again, is a classic example of how you create a movement, you maintain that movement, and you see it through. All right? No, it's been a struggle to keep the political parties from taking over. And at the end of the day, because the political parties didn't take over, at the end of the day, they end up undermining the struggles of the people at Linden. But I leave that for another program.
I understand, and a section of the forum will be devoted to African Guyanese and the struggle for racial democracy. What is racial democracy?
Go,
Uh,
David.
You
Of
know,
course, I'll put my 2 cents in just now. but
the
let
classical
him go.
definition of democracy is one person, one vote, and the majority, one person, one vote, and majoritarianism. That's the classical definition of democracy, which has worked well for ethnically homogeneous societies. You know, the United States, for the most part, is a majority, overwhelming majority white society, European societies, and so forth. But in ethnically divided society, in racially divided society, especially sharply racially divided societies, where you have at least 2 groups of relative equal capacity and strength, it means that definition of democracy has to be relooked. Because if you have a group that is 51% of the population, another one that is 42% of the population, and voting is along ethnic lines, it means, therefore, that according to the Western notion of democracy, that the group at 51% will win and win and win and win, and the one with 42% is excluded. All right? And we feel that democracy in Guyana, as a result of that, has to take into consideration the ethnic component. That Guyana cannot be a democratic state if for 28 years one ethnic group is left out, and then when that one exits, the other one takes over for 20 odd years, 21 years now, and the other ethnic group is left out. So what we're seeing is whether it was 28 years of non-democracy and 21 years of democracy, the outcome is the same, which is racial exclusion. And so therefore a democracy in Guyana has to take into consideration that each ethnic group is entitled to self-determination, each ethnic group is entitled to participate in decision making that affect them. That you can't have an East Indian elite making decisions for African people. It's not even right for that East Indian elite to be making decisions for the East Indian working people. Much more to be making decisions for another ethnic group. And so therefore when we talk about racial democracy, we're talking about making sure that all ethnic groups are included in the governmental decision making of the country.
You said you wanted to add something.
No, I think he's been pretty comprehensive.
We talk as well about ethnicity from the political perspective. Is that the same as the racial democracy? Are we suggesting, like they have in Suriname, that you have parties representing particular racial groups? Is that what you're suggesting here?
Part of the process, I mean, we're talking about equality at the level of the central government. All right? But we're also talking about local democracy. You started this program with a commentary on local government. We're talking about local democracy. We're saying that African people in their villages must have some kind of control over what happens in their villages. So, for example, one of the things that we intend to talk about is a return to the village councils, because the Constitution of Guyana allows for communities that request that they want to go back to village councils, that they do that. And once that request is made, the understanding is that the government would grant that request. So one of the things we will be encouraging at this conference is that the villages, the African villages, should begin a discourse about a return to village democracy, a return to the village system, because tied up with the village system is the whole notion of ancestral lands, which is a burning issue in the African Guyanese community. My brother here never, every time he sees me, which has been pretty often recently, he has always said, David, the question of land is important. Well, the question of land is tied to the question of village, and it's tied to the question of democracy. So we're talking about democracy at the level where the parties that represent the group, will be, will do their thing at that level. But we're talking about the devolution of power to the communities, where the people in their communities will be able to also make decisions.
But Dr. Hinds is saying, Dr. Ng-A-Qui, that is what our Constitution calls for. Why have we either been so complacent, been lazy, careless, or whatever you want to say. Why is it not being done? And this is a broader question now, not only to African Guyanese, to Guyanese. What do you think the problem is? We have local government elections. How could we and our elected representatives go to parliament to deny? That's what they do. When they vote to postpone, they vote to deny. Why do we do that? And why do we encourage it? And we vote those same people in?
Well, we are beginning to put a stop to that. That is part of what this forum is about. Is to develop people's power. I have to, invoke Walter Rodney here. Because we have not exercised people's power. Politicians know two things. They know how to get votes, and they know how to control power. When you're talking about other things, that is the role of the people. I don't like the term civil society, but it is a role of mobilizing people in their communities, in their tongues, in their wards, to be able to be custodians of their own power. And I think insofar as we have not been able to do that, we have this lazy, lax, sometimes opportunistic political leadership on the top that cares very little about how what they're doing affect people's ordinary lives. All they look at is the power equation.
I think a lot has to do with how the consciousness of people, right? And I think part of this entire forum will be the raising of the consciousness of people throughout the diaspora in Guyana, to the point where they can understand that there is truth, and then there are lies. There are good politicians, and then there are bad politicians. Not all politicians are the same. There are good Indians, there are bad Indians. There are good black people, there are bad black people. There are good Portuguese, there are bad Portuguese.
I think Ng-A-Qui said no guilty race. Is that?
Yeah, but the point is, people have to understand how that affects them, and have to understand also that they have a say in what affects them. It's not just a passive, I can't do anything about it. People can mobilize, and this is why when you talk about leadership, if a group, let me give you an example, if a group decides that they want to have a communal farm in back of Buxton, communal farm, to grow food for the whole village and for 10 villages, they should feel empowered to do that, right?
So what stops them?
Well, what stops them is the whole history that we're talking about here. It's not one thing. It's not one single issue. It's their concept, people's concept of the economics, their political, their social, and their cultural perspective. It's their knowledge. It's their lack of knowledge of what they can do. And once that is raised, then you'll have a whole dynamic that is different.
We've got about 8 minutes more, so I want to focus now on this forum and how and what it's going to achieve. You will have the forum. You will have various presentations, participation. How do you get that message out? Because part of the marginalization or the dispossession, and we're not only talking the past 21 years, but you're talking over the period of time. Not many black businesses, not many black television stations. I don't think any newspaper outlet. How do you get that message out?
Okay, let me give you, it's a very good question. If the forum can accomplish letting people understand that the fact that there is only one black quotes television station, the fact that there are no black radio stations, right? There is no black news. If people can understand that in itself speaks the
Lending
history,
institution,
right? That in itself is part of why black people are in the condition that black people are in. If people can really internalize that and take it home with them, the forum would have been a success, because what it means is they would ask themselves the same question: why? And then once that starts to ferment, then the rest of the forum hopefully will provide some information. Now, to act on that information still requires the individuals in the community to get involved. But the people that are going there, that are going to be making presentations, are not the ones that are going to take the message back. Part of what is intended is for the people who come to the forum to themselves be the instrument of action.
Yeah, but how many people can get it?
Whoever comes there.
And that is why
it
Chris
is their responsibility to do that.
And that is why we're taking it.
Yeah.
That's why we're taking it to the rest of the country. We see this as a process that will take
Yeah.
a minimum of a year and continue, because we're battling against tremendous odds. Let me give you two quick examples of what I'm talking about. 30 years ago, Brother Ng-A-Qui came to my house, me and my brothers, we were living together, me and my brother George, and says that we have a problem in Buxton. Families, parents are spending so much time in the lines trying to get scarce items. The kids are going home in the middle without food. And he says, we've got to do something about it. And we sat down on our steps at about 2 o'clock that morning, and we came up with this notion of what we call a soup kitchen in the village. That we will cook hot meals for these kids, so they come home instead of going home where the parents are, they will come for these hot meals. And then we came to the question, how do we finance it? And we decided we're going to take a tally of all the people who were working in the village and ask them for an initial investment in that pool. We did that, and that soup kitchen ran for more than a decade and provided relief in that village. Today, if you were to come up with such a project, some people would say, let me go and beg the government. Right? So you have two models. Right, you have two models.
Yeah.
And we want to bring back the former model. I mean, as you know, part of my battle with my comrades in Buxton is this this notion on the part of some of well-meaning community leaders that the only way you can do something in your community is go to beg the government.
The PPP has no difficulty in identifying with the Hindu community. The Muslim community has no difficulty with identifying with the PPP. Is there some sense that the PNC is reluctant to promote, to recognize, and to promote the cause of African Guyanese?
The PNC has always had that difficulty. And I alluded to it earlier in the program. They've always had the difficulty how to balance the political responsibility to the country and their political responsibility to their constituency. People who vote for them day in, day out. There seem to have always been, Mr. Burnham benefited in the early from the fact that there was Askrea and Guyana who were doing the kind of cultural work. And so the PNC as a party could do the political work. Once Askrea became part of the WP and it was no longer there, we saw the difficulty in the PNC in terms of doing that. And they've always had difficulty in working the two together. Now, part of it has to do with the whole Western notion, right, of quote-unquote, race is not important. That you feel if you say, I am not a black party, but black people vote for me, so I have to look after that. If you do that, you're somewhat being racial. Well, you know, the PPP doesn't have to say that. Dr. Jagan was always very clear, and that when he talked about the working class, he always referred to sugar workers. And sugar workers were Indians. It's a classic example of how you do it. I don't think the PNC has mastered how to link race and class
Is
together.
it that they haven't mastered or they don't want to do it?
Well, I will leave that for another program. I don't want to be overly critical of the PNC on the program. I want us to put some more focus on how we're correcting these problems.
I know this statement has probably been made by not you, but maybe Dr. Hinds. Whenever African Guyanese community has won any big advances, it has always been laced with political activism. That is the whole issue of rebellion, overcoming slavery, colonialism. It is political in nature. Should every black community, therefore, become political in nature? And what does that political mean? Is it partisan political or cause political, movement political?
Every community is political in nature. For us to think that this is something exclusive to blacks, I think we've been missing the whole context. Everything that we do is political in nature, whether it be black communities or Indian communities. So again, you can't separate out and try to identify that this community is a political community. this community is not a political community. All communities are political.
But
And
is
all,
it political
yeah,
in
in nature.
partisan term?
all communities have, regardless of where they are, have a partisan component in them. In Guyana, because this country is a bunch of racial enclaves, and we need to be truthful about that, and not assume that you can separate out, this is racial but not political, and this is political. It's all, and this is why the context of the forum, right? The context of the forum is all things, and this is why they're all plenary sessions, they're all full sessions. Everybody has to understand that it's all inclusive.
It seems to me that a lot of this started the racial division, not only the leadership, but the question of the competition that took place, that began with the importation, particularly of Indian labor, to make up for the end of slavery. When will it be appropriate, and is it this forum at some point out of it, to say to the Indian community, look, it's time we sit down and discuss how we can address these historical problems, which it really started at that point.
But in a sense, we're hoping that we signal it to our sister communities. Sister Ndaye and myself had, I think 10 or 11 years ago, mooted the whole question of simultaneous conversations within each ethnic community, and conversation among and between the communities. And we hope that East Indian Guyanese would engage in such a conversation. Amerindians definitely have a need to engage in such conversation. And we hope that this would lead to a general national conversation that will lead to a national solution, so that together we can move our country forward.
Dr. Ng-A-Qui, I must apologize. I'm not able to give you the last word. We have to wrap up. I do want to, and if you want to make that appeal and the announcement again, maybe you can do it.
Go ahead.
On August 4th, Sunday, August 4th, the State of Africa, Black African Guyanese at Agda Compound, it's an all-day conversation. Come and be part of this conversation. Come and be part of making your own history and advancing your own community. We have always talked, boy, things bad with black people. Black people don't unite. Black people don't do this. Black people don't do that. Now is our time to make a start and to put an end to that. So wherever you are, come out to that forum on Sunday, August 4th at the compound,
7:30.
beginning at 7:30, and that is on Thomas Lands. Make sure you're there. And if you're in the far road communities, we are going to come to where you are.
Dr. David Hinds, Dr. Norman Ng-A-Qui, thank you very much for appearing on Plain Dog. Operators and viewers, thank you. Good night. See you next week.